Hey everyone, I'm Trent Kusters, co-founder and studio director at League of Geeks, and you're listening to The Game Maker's Notebook. Today I'm chatting with Julian Gollop. He's the CEO and creative director of Snapshot Games. But that name may sound familiar. And if so, it's because he is also a legendary game designer. That's right, folks. We're talking to the creator of the original XCOM. But he has also had an illustrious career spanning a number of decades with many other titles in it. So what do we talk about today? We dive into his early childhood, hanging out in the arcades, the games that impressed him there. We talk about playing computer games and tabletop games with his family, including the annual board game ritual that his dad had that perhaps led to this entire illustrious game design career. We then talk about the company that he founded with his brother Nick and his father, Mythos Games, that would, of course, go on to develop XCOM with Microprose, as well as a number of other titles. We do talk a bit about XCOM, of course, for those of you who are here for that. Don't worry, Julian lays out the entire timeline. We dive into design. We dive into the actual development of like the world sphere. There's so much there that we talk about. We even discuss the point of development where the game was cancelled and they had no idea. And then we talk about his move to Bulgaria, where he is now, and his time at Ubisoft Sofia, which was an interesting time for Julian in his career because it seemed to have a lot of handheld development in it. And then we speak about how the Kickstarter craze lured him away from Ubisoft to again found his own studio, this time with partner David Kay. And we speak about Chaos Reborn, its development. We talk about the response to that game and how it actually led to development of something bigger. So we talk about scaling up scope. And we talk about Chip and Clawz, which is their latest game that's coming out soon. There's some really interesting stuff that Julian talks to there about constraints, accessibility, rotating IPs or trying to find the right mix. His take on when to lean into design conventions and when they can actually be your enemy. This is a great conversation, folks. It's a real treat to have him here. And I just can't wait for you to dive in. So I'm not going to hold you up any longer. Without further ado, here's Julian Gollop, CEO and creative director of Snapshot Games.
Our new building a test.
Take that, Earthling!
This thing is awesome!
My saucer section is off limits!
The Brainioids are bashing our HQ!
Take that, you insolent bipeds!
Julian, welcome to the Game Maker's Notebook.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
Yeah, it's exciting. You've had a long storied career, and we're going to take it all the way back to the start, like we usually do on the podcast. Tell me, Julian, not what was your first video game memory, but what was your first game memory that kind of set your brain alight? And it might very well be the first as well, but was there one that you can remember, like this feeling of games having an impact on you, or you might tie all of this wonderful, illustrious and long career that you've had and a life spent with video games back to that as the defining moment that sort of set you on this path?
Oof, yeah, that is going back a long way. But yes, I do remember that I was particularly impressed with the first video game, I guess, that I saw, and it was one of these little implementations of Pong. She played with a little sort of twisty paddle-like thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's sort of black and white. This would have been around 1976, I think, if I remember correctly.
77 was when Pong first went into living
Right.
rooms, right? So
It might have been 77.
Yeah.
Somewhere around that time. It's definitely before 1978, put it that way. So, because after that, I remember, we used to go to the arcades, and my favorites there, which made probably a big impression, were Robotron, Defender, Asteroids, which were, in my view, very, very cool games. I think my favorite of those was probably Robotron. I wasn't necessarily very good at them, and I didn't actually have enough money to spend on them to get good at them.
Yeah.
But yeah, I was absolutely fascinated, especially with the animation, the graphics, the visual effects, which were all done obviously with very small processor and pixels, a small amount of colors.
Yeah.
Still impressive what they achieved even to this day.
And so was this in your early teen years that you were hanging out at the arcade seeing these things go down?
Yeah, so I would have been around 13, 14, I guess. Yeah, absolutely. And of course, your home computers were not a thing at all at that point.
Yeah.
A little later, we got one of these, again, home consoles, which have Pong on them. It's a Binatone thing, sort of console, which had sort of Pong and several other variants on it.
Cool.
But there you go. But at that point, I was actually more interested in board games, war games, and role-playing games.
Right. Okay. Is that where your journey with making games, even like in a hobbyist sense, started? Were you making little homebrew games at home or anything, or was it just diving in with your friends?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I think the first board game that I made I was around about 11. It was like a little car racing game where I made little models of cars with gear sticks in it, and the gear you select, it gave you an addition to your dice roll to move, but you run the risk of spinning out. It's kind of pretty cool. But yeah, I was making games from around that time, board games. My father was actually probably a major influence here, because he used to, every Christmas, he would buy a new board game. We always played card games. In particular, he was very much into cribbage and bridge.
Okay.
But we always played a lot of board games at Christmas time, especially one which kind of stood out, which was a favorite of the entire family, which was Escape from Colditz.
Escape from Colditz. I've never heard of it. What was set it up for us? What was the board game?
Oh, it's a classic board game. So it's about the notorious World War II German prison at Colditz. And one player played the Germans, the guards, and the other players, could be quite a few players, were trying to cooperate to escape from Colditz, escape from the prison.
Incredible. I've never heard of this game. Incredible. A classic, you say. Yeah.
It is an absolute classic. Absolutely, yes. Yeah.
Wow, amazing. And so that was a family favorite of a Sunday evening, sitting there breaking out of a German POW camp.
Yep, exactly.
I love it. Amazing. And so this was a central part of your childhood, it sounds like, games and coming through.
Yes. Even going back a bit earlier when we were playing chess. But even there, I remember trying to invent alternative rules for chess. I think I remember one variant where you had to set up in the corners of the board, and we had to change the movement rules for the pawns and everything.
Right.
That I was doing when I was 7 or 8, I think. So,
did your father have any homebrew games that he busted out or anything?
No,
never dabbled as a hobbyist.
Not really. He was into the mainstream games. Like I said, his favorite ones were probably bridge and cribbage. And the board games, again, was something that he bought for the family. Like I say, he'd buy one new one per year at Christmas time.
Love it.
Which was cool.
So when did you mentioned, sort of starting off with some board games and tabletop games, but sort of help us chart this kind of a teenage Julian standing around the arcades and, playing some role-playing games or whatever, and then to getting into some development. Did you have an eye to study this at school or in college or anything? When did you sort of find your way to some more serious development?
Well, not really. So when I was at school, I think the first computer that I acquired was the Sinclair ZX81, which I bought secondhand from a friend in 1982. And I started to make games on it straight away. But my biggest influence, even at that point, was still mostly the board war games that I was playing, particularly from SPI, the little hex and counters games.
Oh, cool.
Avalon Hill is the other one. And there was one particular, it was a magazine, like Strategy and Tactics. It was a magazine published by SPI called Ares Magazine, which I think first released in 1980. And this was science fiction and fantasy themed little war games. And there was a game with each magazine. I think they released them monthly. So these things were incredibly influential in the first games that I was really trying to create. Turn-based war games, tactics games. Games that were influential here were games like Sniper, which is a World War II game where you had individual characters, soldiers, that you had to plot the move on a piece of paper simultaneously with your opponent.
Wow.
Squad Leader is another one. And then some more ambitious fantasy games from SPI like Freedom in the Galaxy, which is essentially a Star Wars style simulation where you played with characters performing missions on planets. There was a big sort of galactic army confrontation involved as well.
Mm-hmm.
So even up to that point, when I first got my computer, these were most influential. I also have to add Dungeons and Dragons, of course.
It's always there somewhere in the shelf, right? Yeah.
Played from, 1980, 1981 to something we used to play every Sunday with my brother and a group of friends.
Right.
Also very influential in some of my early video games. So up to that point, then I obviously got my ZX81. I actually learned to program on that. So I was programming initially in BASIC. It was very limited because it had 1K of memory. I bought a 16K RAM pack, which I had to basically stick to a big kind of wooden board because any movement in this RAM pack would cause the machine to crash.
Wow.
The dreaded RAM pack wobble, as it was called. So this one, I also learned a little bit of assembly language.
Right.
Because BASIC was very limited on the ZX81. It had a Z80 processor, which is kind of quite advanced in a way for its time.
Mm.
And yeah, so I did actually make some games for it. I didn't really save any of them, but I can't even remember what they were, most of them.
Yeah. Just fiddling around at home on it?
Yeah, some simple stuff. I tried to do a little flight sim style thing where you're trying to land an airplane. I remember that one.
Yeah.
I tried to do one which was more of a strategy game simulation in a solar system which had planets orbiting the sun, stuff like that. But it's very difficult to really do very much in that machine. I wasn't really able to progress much until I got my next machine, which was the Sinclair Spectrum 48K, which had a massive 48K of memory.
And no wobble, I assume, at that point in time? They'd fix the wobble issue?
No, there's no need for an additional RAM pack there either. I mean, 48K was a lot. Yeah. I mean, it was a very efficiently made machine because you required maybe about 7K for the video memory. So you had around 41K of RAM to do what you want.
Yeah, just to play with, right?
Yeah, which was like a huge amount to me at the time.
Yeah.
So, I thought I can actually do something more substantial with this one. And I was indeed correct. So, I mean, I think the first game that I made for the Spectrum 48K was a game called Nebula. And it's kind of like a 4X game, I guess, before 4X games were a thing. You had galactic expansion. You had to conquer planets, extract resources, deal with threats, improve your technology. That was almost all programmed. Actually, it was entirely programmed in BASIC, by the way, interestingly.
Right. Stuck with the BASIC, yeah.
Well, for that, yeah. So with the 48K Spectrum, I thought, at least I can make a game in BASIC on this one, unlike with the ZX81. So yeah, it was basic. It was released and published by Redshift. So this was a company set up by a group of friends. Who are all older than me. But we had Nebula was published. Actually, I had a couple of other games published before that, which I designed but didn't program because I didn't have my own machine. I made a game called Time Lords, which was a time travel one, loosely based on a Doctor Who theme.
Yeah.
Game called Islandia, which was again a little bit of a 4X game, but this time set at sea with islands.
And tell us a little bit about the process, just quickly, of designing. When you say you designed those games back then, or like, what did that mean? Were you putting together a documentation? Were you kind of meeting up with these folks and just talking it out? Or
documentation? No. So actually, with the Time Lords game, interestingly, it started off as a pencil and paper game.
Yeah, right. Okay.
And you required a sort of game master, and the game master had a little set of tables by which he constructed the universe. You had to roll the dice, and it gave you results, and you had to fill in the details for like 5 planets and 15 time zones. And then the players can then travel around in time, and you tell them, the game master will tell them what they've encountered, and then you might try and influence a war one way or the other. So it was a pure pencil and paper game to start with. And this is basically what became the first computer game that I designed. Was implemented again by a school friend of mine on the BBC Model B computer this time.
Right, okay, yeah.
So that was how that was done. Islandia, I can't remember the process there. I think I probably did create some more documentation for that one. But yeah.
So yeah, prototyping, essentially making them like an analog tabletop game.
Paper prototypes. Yeah. And it's something I continue to do actually for quite a while.
Wow, fantastic.
So with my first game that I made for the Spectrum, this was a game called Rebel Star Raiders, which was a 2-player only game, interestingly. And it's a sort of tactical turn-based combat game with a sci-fi setting, which obviously became a sort of running theme with my creations, I guess.
Yeah, I'm noticing that.
Yeah, so that was really cool. Again, mostly programmed in BASIC, and it didn't have an AI, so you had to play it with with another player.
Right, okay.
Sold reasonably well, actually, though we didn't get much money from it.
Yeah. And at this time, for our listeners as well, just sort of filling in on this time, how are you distributing this? Are you bagging them up in little, with the slips and selling them at a market, or are you mailing them out to folks?
Yeah, we did. So with Redshift, we used to, they were distributing them to shops. You go to these computer fairs as well and sell them there. But it was some distribution done. Again, I wasn't really running the business. I was just making games. I didn't really quite know exactly how they distributed it, but I remember going to some of these
being extracted, by the man.
Yes,
right?
Exactly. Yeah. I do remember going to early computer fairs, though. I mean, that was very cool. And literally, I remember Time Lords, for example, was in a little Ziploc bag with a cardboard insert and a little cassette in there, and that was it.
Yeah, I remember them, how they used to look. Yeah.
Yep.
Great stuff. And so this is, we're talking about a job here. What is this, literally a job? Had you finished school at this point? Are you doing it sort of on the side?
So at the time, so at the time Nebula and Rebel Star Raiders were kind of done. I had just left school.
Yeah, okay.
And I was taking a year out before going to university at the London School of Economics. And I then started, I kind of remember it was just in 1984, beginning of 1984, a game which became Chaos Battle of the Wizards. And this was again based on a board game that I made. And in the board game, you had, there was a deck of cards which had your spells on it. Shuffle those randomly, don't out spells to each player. You had a wizard character who had some stats. The board was just this big sheet of paper with a large grid. So when you cast a spell or summoned a creature, you literally place the card on the board and then start moving it around. So this was the game that I really wanted to make. And it's also the first game that I made using assembly language completely.
Oh.
Has some interesting bugs, by the way. But it was published by Games Workshop, believe it or not. and they had just started to produce a few computer games. So my friends at Redshift had made an adaptation of one of their board games called Apocalypse. And they actually went on to make a few other adaptations of Games Workshop games, one of which I helped out with, which is called Battle Cars. I remember doing the car designer module for that. But actually, yeah, so Chaos Battle of the
This
Wizards.
is mid-'80s, this era, right?
Yeah, we're talking like
Games Workshop,
1984. Yes,
Yeah,
1984. I think I finished the game in 1985, and I think Chaos was actually published in 1985. But by that time, I was at college studying for my economics and sociology degree, supposedly. But
Supposedly, I love it.
yeah, I know. I think it's I still continue making. I remember I was trying to finish off Chaos, very hard, so I can actually go back to attending some of my university classes and lectures.
Be a functioning student once again.
Yeah.
Now, talk to me about economics and sociology, because it's clear that you've been developing games now leading up to this and during it and everything. Obviously, today, folks would naturally probably go into a comp sci degree or something.
Yeah.
What was it that drew you to economics and sociology? I mean, I can see the influences of your interest in those things in your games, but talk to me about college.
Yes. Well, I studied economics at school. Sociology was something I was interested in, probably due to the influence of my mum in particular. She also studied sociology and anthropology.
Oh, cool.
Both subjects are very interesting. So, yeah, economics was really cool. Politics, economics, sociology. I actually studied several modules at LSE, including criminology.
Oh, wow.
But I didn't get very far with that. You know, I also did a computing course as well at LSE.
Oh, you did? Okay, cool.
There's one computing course which I thought was completely useless, to be honest. It didn't teach me anything.
Yeah, I'm sure maybe the teachers weren't shipping their own games in their part-time, probably. Yeah.
Yeah, and the way it was taught is that they were using BBC Model B microcomputers as a kind of dumb terminal to a VAX machine, and the way you had to do your exercises, you had to enter them into like the console, send them off to the VAX machine to compile. At some point, you'll get a result. I mean, it could be many minutes later, depending how many people are trying to use it. And it'll give you some obscure error report. You then had to look up the error in a little sort of guide to say, oh, what error this is.
Yeah.
Then go back to your code, fix the errors, and then send it off to compile. It's very stupid and very inefficient.
It sounds it, yeah.
And, and they had a perfectly good machine there, which is the BBC Model B, which had a very good implementation of BASIC. And I don't know why they didn't just use that to teach people BASIC. Why do you need to use this VAX machine, this sort of big mini computer somewhere, wherever it was, who knows? It was bonkers. Anyway, that was a waste of time.
Yeah, right.
But ultimately I was kind of running out of money. I only had partial state support for my, university studying.
Yeah. Okay.
So I had the great idea, well, why don't I just, make another game and get it sold? So, I started working on another one while I was in, I think, my second year at university. So I was kind of going back to the original Rebel Star Raiders theme, which is the turn-based tactical sci-fi thing. And this was a game called Rebel Star. It's again was 2-player only, and I remember taking a demo to I think it was Telecom Soft. So it was just the publisher set up by British Telecom, the main sort of telecommunications operator.
Yeah.
And I said, "Oh, this looks great, but we need to have it needs to have a single player mode. Nobody's going to play this.
Yeah. Okay.
I thought, oh my goodness, I have to go and work out how to make an AI for this game. So again, I went back to my college dorm room. Again, didn't attend any lectures or classes. Nobody, people were actually getting worried where I was when I was doing this. I spent probably about 2-3 weeks, maybe maximum, figuring out how to implement an AI and proper pathfinding across a large, fairly complex map to make this game have a single player mode. And I did it, and it worked, and it was not bad.
Do you remember having a eureka or an aha moment, or was it kind of like just this slow rolling snowball effect of putting your brain to the grindstone?
Well, I sort of did. I remember I had a big, very large sheet of square paper, which was my map that the game was set in. And I basically took that and divided it up into rectangles. And then I built a table which says, if you want to go from rectangle A to rectangle B, then you need to head towards this point, because I had a very inefficient pathfinding could basically just head towards something and maybe navigate around obstacles. So if you want to go all the way across the map to this place, you must head first to this spot, and when you get, which is in the adjacent rectangle. Once you get to that rectangle, again, you check the table where you need to go next. Okay. It's also a little table area-based pathfinding system, which was manually entered. It's very efficient, very efficient, very quick. It was fine. I have to do other bits of AI to stop and shoot enemies. They had a little patrolling system, so enemies would patrol. But yeah, so 3 weeks later, that was done. Took it back to Telecomsoft. They said, great. They published it. It was in one of their very cheap ranges. I think it's called Firebird. So this sold for like £2.
Wow.
Not very expensive.
Yeah.
And I think I was getting something like 10p per copy, an absolutely atrocious royalty rate. But still, it sold a lot. And I got what I thought was a very large amount of money from it.
Yeah.
And I immediately...
You're only of college age at this point as well, right?
So yeah. So, wow, this is a lot of money.
Money, it seems like, yeah.
Yes. So I immediately went out and bought an electric guitar, as you do.
As you do. I love it. Yeah, good on you.
And I kind of, I guess at this point, my college career was not going well. In fact, even though I, finished the game, I was actually spending a lot of my time at the college bar drinking beer, or in some other place smoking weed or whatever. My college career was not progressing, so I kind of flunked most of the exams for my second year, and I thought, well, okay, I should probably think about my career at this point.
Yeah.
So I decided to leave college and try and set up my own company. Again, I was encouraged by a friend of mine back in my hometown of Harlow. And graciously, my dad decided to put up some money into the company.
And your dad?
Which is great of him. Yeah.
Yep. Especially after investing in all those board games already, which you could say kind of investing in your company as well. Yeah. Exactly.
So it wasn't a lot of money. He seemed to think that it didn't actually cost that much to make computer games. I think it's a bit, but he wasn't doing it for free. I mean, he took a share in the company. He had a big share in the company. So the share was originally it was my friend, and then my brother joined me. So then it was me, my brother, and my father, who both had roughly equal shares in this company. And we actually changed the name of the company as well at that point. I think we set up a new one called Mythos Games.
Yep.
But anyway, so my brother had finished his college degree and he came to work with me. He didn't know much about programming at that point either, to be honest. I had to teach him the basics of Z80 assembly language. But, he was
developing with you. So you're saying he was actually developing games too. Didn't come on as a business interest or anything like that.
No. So the friend I set up the company with originally left. Then my brother came on board to help with the programming
development.
So I had to teach him the basics of Z80 assembly language. He learned obviously very quickly. He's very sharp, very intelligent. He just put his head down and learned it. So the next game we made here, again, is a bit of an evolution again of the turn-based tactical thing. Again, it was a bit of a running theme, like I said. So we made Laser Squad. It was called turn-based tactical game with AI from the get-go this time, and we made it across a whole bunch of machines actually. So I was doing the Spectrum version. My brother Nick was working on the Commodore 64 version, which is a whole new machine that we had to learn.
And I imagine in that time, like when you're developing for different platforms, I guess you would call them now, or different PCs, is it from the ground up you're developing, or is there just particular things you're doing for that particular environment, but the bulk of the work is the same? How is it? How are you approaching things?
Well, in terms of how we developed it, in terms
for
of
each one,
what is our game engine? You see,
exactly.
Yeah, it's interesting. So, well, the thing about these machines in those days, obviously, there's no game engine. I think we used a few routines in the ROM for saving and loading stuff.
Yep. Okay.
But that was it. Everything else was hand designed and coded in assembly language. There was obviously my experience working on Rebel Star and Chaos were very good. So you basically have to code everything, anything that requires, so printing sprites on the screen or scrolling screen. So the big innovation for Laser Squad is, we had a controller input, I guess one thing. We had a little battle preparation where you had to equip the soldiers. It had a scrolling screen. I'd done the scrolling screen in Rebel Star, actually.
Yeah, great.
So, you're building up this little library of routines and functions that you're using. And we had to translate these to the 6502 processor on the Commodore 64, which also had a very different sound chip.
Right. So you are effectively building them up in assembly and then porting them to these different PCs.
Yeah. So from the ground up, firstly in Z80 and then porting to 6502. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Then we had the Amstrad CPC. Again, that was Z80 based, but it had a very different screen format. So I remember I was working on I did a port of Rebel Star for that. At that point, Amstrad, Alan Sugar made a big move into computers. He'd already been making these cheap hi-fi things already. There was an Amstrad home computer. So they were probably the three biggest home computer formats, the Spectrum, Commodore 64, and Amstrad CPC. The BBC machine was just too expensive for most people. Okay. So then what did we do? Oh, yeah, so we had Laser Squad. So that was released, and we published it ourselves. So we were effectively a publisher. And we had to get the box made, the cassettes manufactured, and then we had to send these. We had to literally do our sales pitch to all of the distributors who distributed to the shops. We had to ship the games to them. They sent to the shops. And we thought we had a really clever idea as well, because in our boxes, a nice manual I had with a little coupon at the end, which allowed you to send off for expansions by mail order. So Laser Squad was divided into scenarios. I think we were like 2 tapes in the box, and there was like 3 scenarios. And the idea is you could send off a coupon, buy a couple of extra missions, extra scenarios for a few pounds. And we actually did a lot of business that way.
Yeah, it's straight through
like
consumer,
a mail order.
Right?
Yeah, mail order expansions, additional content. Yeah, and of course that we obviously bypassed the retail doing that, which is cool.
Yeah. Quite the little enterprise you've got going here. I can imagine.
Yes.
Tell me about the buzz during those days. Do you remember it being like hard work or endlessly tiring, or do you remember just being filled with energy and excitement in those early days?
Yes.
It can be both as well. yes.
Were we excited? I guess we were, but we actually, in terms of business, it wasn't great. We weren't exactly making a lot of money. And the problem is, how do you fund your next project?
The classic problem,
Yeah, exactly. At one point, we decided we were not that good at marketing, so we actually took Laser Squad to another publisher, and they published it as well. However, they also went bust, which didn't help us very much. I remember we also started doing 16-bit programming with the Atari ST and Commodore Amiga at that point, which was a lot more work. And it got to the point. So our next game that we did, which was called Lords of Chaos, was a fantasy-themed turn-based game, really cool. And we made this for the Sinclair Spectrum, Amstrad Color Computer, the Commodore 64. The Atari ST, then Commodore Amiga, and that was a lot of work. That was quite hard.
Hard in what way? When you say a lot of work, what was just like the working?
Yeah, the 3 different processes. Yeah. And we also adapted the game for the 16-bit consoles, and I was doing all the graphics as well. As well as coding.
Right, okay, you're making the sprites and everything.
Yep, absolutely. Yep. Yeah, and all the sound effects and everything.
Yeah, incredible. Yeah, and so the team, and so is it just still you and your brother developing at this time? It's just the two of you? Okay,
just the two of us, And, again, because our publisher went bust, we were back to square one in terms of financially. We had nothing to continue with, basically.
Yeah.
And I remember at this point, I did some very boring computing work for a friend, which paid reasonably well, while my brother Nick was working on a demo for what we tentatively called Laser Squad 2, with the idea that we would then take this to another publisher. And we were making the demo on the Atari ST. It was fully assembly language. It had a nice scrolling map. And our big innovation with Laser Squad 2 was this 3-dimensional space.
Yeah.
We had bullets that could not just go left and right, they could go up and down. And we kind of simulated using sprites, this 3D space using isometric graphics, for which I was heavily inspired by an earlier Spectrum 48 game called Night Law.
Night Law, cool name.
Yes.
I never heard of it. Very cool.
This was by a company called Ultimate Play the Game, which later became Rare.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So, some of my inspiration so in the early days of the Sinclair Spectrum, Rare, or Ultimate Play the Game as we're known, had a big reputation doing very technically advanced games. And there's a whole bunch of those which I was very impressed with. Night Law, Attic Attack, Trans Am. I think I bought quite a few of their games, and they were technically really advanced and also really good games.
Oh yeah, and I guess the legacy continued into Rare as well.
Yes, because as you know, they became a legendary game developer.
Yes, very much so.
But they're in their early days, they were way ahead of the pack. Still, it's quite obvious they had serious talent. But anyway, Night Law was an isometric puzzle game. Very cool. Again, had a 3-dimensional model of the actual world, and this is what we. So, with Laser Squad 2, we did this. We had elevation. We had multiple levels of the game rather than just a 2-dimensional grid.
Oh, cool.
So the next thing we had to do is decide which publisher we're going to take this demo to, and we had a short list. Top of our list was Microprose, for very obvious reasons that we were big fans of Microprose games, and in particular, my brother Nick was highly addicted to Civilization, Master of Orion, Master of Magic. And, I remember during the day that we were working on Lords of Chaos, and, get to lunchtime, Nick would start playing one of these games. And when I start playing one of Microprose games, and maybe we would forget about getting back to work sometimes.
The afternoon would just one more turn, as they say, right?
Exactly. So, I mean, in our opinion, Microprose were, the best of the best. And we thought there's very little chance that they would publish our tiny little game, which is called Laser Squad 2. But, they were still top of our list for companies to approach. So we contacted their UK office, which is based in Chipping, Sudbury, in the west of England. And so he arranged a meeting, went over to show it to them, and they were kind of impressed. So there was a guy there called Steve Hand, who was, fortunately for us, was a big fan of Laser Squad.
Oh, great.
Because apparently the others there were somewhat skeptical of this game.
Mm-hmm.
And but he insisted that we, try and publish our game. So we went then for a next meeting, and they handed us a bit of an interesting challenge. They said, "Look, we like the game, but we need it to be more like Civilization. We want a tech tree, for example. We want some kind of progression system. We want multiple missions." And the other thing is, the theme is we wanted it more Earth-based. This is their thing. They said, look, it's more relatable if it's Earth-based. So the theme they came up with was UFOs, and this was actually based on Jerry Anderson's TV series called UFO, which I was familiar with, though I hadn't seen much of it.
Did they have the license, or was it just based on it, sort of inspired?
No, just based on the concept. Yeah. And the main thing they kept saying to us, we need this to be a bigger game. This needs to be as big as Civilization. And I thought, oh my goodness me, we're supposed to do this.
Yeah.
So that was an interesting challenge, but I thought it was, what they did was really great. Both Pete Mullen there, who was responsible ultimately for commissioning the game, and Steve Hand were really instrumental in getting the game approved and contracted. So we went away. I did some research. Obviously, I watched a few episodes of UFO, and for the game, which ultimately became XCOM, although it was initially titled UFO Enemy Unknown. So the things we took from the TV series was the concept of the organization. The TV series are called Shadow. And what they did was that they tried to intercept UFOs coming down to Earth. First, they had moon-based interceptors. Then they had aircraft-based interceptors. And if the UFO managed to make it all the way to the ground, they had these ground-based interceptors, which they sent out to try and get the aliens before they did any mischief.
Sounds familiar. Yeah.
Yeah. So we, of course, used this concept in XCOM, not with the moon-based interceptors, but we had this air-based interception system. The idea being that ideally you want to shoot the UFO down so it crashes, so that you can then send your team in to the to the crash site and get what you can from it. So that was cool. The other inspiration was actually a book which was called Alien Liaison by Timothy Good, and this is based on the UFO sort of conspiracy theory lore and stuff. There's a couple of things in that which were really cool. There was a story by a guy called Bob Lazar who claimed to work at Area 51. Working on where they're supposedly captured and were trying to reverse engineer, alien spacecraft. And this was absolutely a concept that we had in the game. That yes, you would try and capture their technology, you would try and reverse engineer it, and then build your own stuff based on their technology.
There's your tech tree. There's the progression that they're looking for, right?
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, and of course, capturing live aliens was also part of it as well. Yeah. So the other thing that we did was, because they said it was Earth-based, this is another innovation, was that we had this what we called the geoscape, our big innovation. So you had this view of the Earth, which you could rotate and zoom in on, which is really cool. And this was programmed by Nick. He did an amazing job programming this, by the way, because it's genuine 3D programming, which wasn't very common in those days. We're talking 1991, by the way.
Yeah.
He had to do his little triangle rendering routines and 3D geometry on a sphere, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I remember how impressive it was at the time. Like, shout out Nick, because it blew people's minds seeing it when that screen would load up. Yeah,
absolutely. And my job in this case was I went out and bought a big atlas and of the world, and I basically had to draw all over this little triangles to try and create a map of triangles for a world, and then I had to extract the polar coordinates from the atlas and then feed them type them into a little data file to build up the actual map of the globe that we had. Wow. So all these elements were coming into place. Of course, we had the core foundation was still Laser Squad 2 with its 3-dimensional isometric graphic system, which was really cool. Another innovation we added to that was the sort of light and darkness stuff, because we had a massive 256 colors to play with, which was amazing on the VGA graphics card. And what we did there was we divided all those colors up into gradients of 16. And to create light and darkness, we would basically add and subtract color values for each pixel as we display
from the gradients that you'd set up.
Yeah. Basically within that gradient with 16 colors. So we had the light and darkness there. Obviously, enemies lurking in the darkness became a major sort of thematic part of XCOM as well.
Yeah, God.
So that's how XCOM initially came together, and Microprose became our publisher.
And so so that you had this meeting with them, they've handed you these very they're very publisher-centric kind of requests, but also quite astute.
Absolutely.
They set you off in this fantastic direction, you know, and had created this historical, seminal classic. But tell us about that period. What was the arrangement at this time? Were they saying, we will fund it, but these are the things that we need, and you went off and did that after you received the funding? Or were they like, come back to us once you've done these things, and then we can proceed with the deal?
Yeah, so they were funding it. I mean, we said, look, we need money to fund this development. And it says, okay, we'll sign a contract with you. And I remember it was an 18-month contract, and we were paid a small amount of money per month with a royalty of around 15% or whatever.
Yep.
So, there were a couple. The issue with that was that, we got to the end of 18 months. We hadn't finished the game, obviously.
Familiar story, yeah.
And, they said, well, look, don't worry about this. It looks promising. Let's keep going. So we just continued working on it. And I remember our producer was pretty relaxed. He would come and visit us in Harlow. We'd go to the pub, have a drink. We'd give him a floppy disk with the latest version to take away with him, and that was sort of it, really.
No alien interventions.
No, there were a couple of artists based at Microprose and Chipping Sodry who were working on the project too.
Like actually on the game itself, or on marketing? Okay, cool.
No, on the game. So one of them was doing the character sprites and all the little animations it required, which was quite complex. So it had various body parts and stuff. And one guy who was doing the environment graphics, and that was it. And then there was me and Nick doing all the coding. So it's essentially a team of 4 for most of the production. Later on, we brought in, John Broomhall doing the music. A guy called Andy who was doing the sound effects and sound system coding. The sound system coding was pretty horrendous in those days because you had to support multiple sound cards, and Microprose had their own system which we used. And obviously, then the Microprose QA team also got involved. It was 4 of them working on it. I remember Andy Luckett here was the head of QA at the time. So, but it wasn't a large team, and we were making. It was such an ambitious game, and when they said to us, you make a big game as big as Civilization, I thought, well, how the hell just 2 of us supposed to do this?
Like, okay, boss. Yeah, right. And so tell me about the game coming together at the end. Do you remember was it hard to put it in a box at the end, or did it kind of just reach a conclusion? Okay, right. Yeah.
No, it was, we haven't got to the horror part of the story yet, no. There were times when the game was nearly cancelled, and the point at which was actually it was cancelled, and we didn't know about it at the time.
Oh, right.
But Microprose were in a bit of financial difficulty. One of the original founders, Bill Steely, had left. They sold the company to Spectrum Holobyte, who specialized mainly in flight sims, by the way.
Okay, right.
And they obviously reviewed all of Microprose's projects. They looked at XCOM and said, what is this crap? You've got to cancel this project.
This money pit over here, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't, Microprose UK, Pete Morland, to his credit, sort of just said okay to Spectrum Holobyte, but he didn't actually cancel the project. He didn't tell us, by the way. We didn't know anything about this. We were blissfully ignorant. So there came a point where Spectrum Holobyte also wanted to have more releases from Microprose UK for their end of financial quarter, which I think was like March 1994. what have you got? And Pete Mullen said to them, well, that game that you said to cancel? Well, we still got it. If you want it, we can get this ready for the end of the financial quarter. And I said, yeah, okay. But the bad news from our point of view is that the game was really not ready. It was not in a good shape. So Microprose said to us, well, look, you got to come and work on site with us in Chipping Sodbury. So me and Nick shipped off to Chipping Sodbury. We stayed in some bed and breakfast. And, every morning we go into Microprose office early in the morning, and we stay there till last thing at night, 7 days a week. It was like major crunch period.
Yeah, grueling.
And we probably spent 2, maybe 3 months, maybe possibly doing that just to try and get the game ready for release in the time that Microprose had committed to Spectrum Holobyte doing, which we did. We managed to do it in the end.
Incredible.
And the game was published, and there you go. So
it happened. Yeah,
it happened.
Beyond all odds, it actually happened. I love that moment of Pete coming to you and saying, okay, so the game was cancelled, not cancelled anymore, but also, that must have been an interesting conversation.
Yeah, he didn't tell us this until sometime after the game was published.
Yeah, smart man.
So, anyway, I guess it all worked out in the end.
Now, obviously, everyone knows of the legacy of XCOM, and it's hailed as, I think IGN called it the greatest PC game of all time. It's an absolutely incredible legacy. But tell me about those moments when it first did release, back in 1994, for that quarter. Was the response immediate? Because obviously game development was different in those days too. You're not doing live support or anything like that. Like, tell me about how it felt after it went out the door and what that process was of seeing it reach peak.
So, initially we didn't think that the game was going to be a big success because it was so different to anything else. There were so many new things in it which nobody had ever played before. It was kind of just very unusual. And the first sign that things were, taking off was, again, there's no World Wide Web available at the time. Well, not to most people anyway. So we had something called CompuServe, which was like a sort of online service. They had a games channel there, moderated sort of games forums, and it was like the game of the month. It was getting a lot of attention on CompuServe. That's really the first time that we noticed that things were going well, because Microprose weren't saying anything to us about how sales were going or anything.
Right. All right. So you and Nick are trying to figure this out in the dark.
Yeah. We were trying to, because we'd finished work on it. They stopped funding development, and we had no money. I mean,
right. So we were existential to you how well this game was doing, as of the utmost importance.
Yeah. So we were pretty anxious about it, and we were trying to get Microprose to commit to a new project. Maybe something which wasn't not a sequel to XCOM, but something different. So it's not really until we got our first royalty check, and this is many months after the game was released, that we realized that actually, the sales report that we got was pretty substantial.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Which was
did they say anything to you when they gave it to you, or did it kind of just arrive and then you're looking at it and going like, oh?
No, they didn't really say anything. I'm not quite sure what was going on there. I mean, there were, as it turns out, there were some issues in the contract relating to the rights to the game, and particularly the rights to the name XCOM.
Interesting.
We actually pitched a bunch of different projects to them, but they actually said, well, we want a sequel.
Yeah, naturally, I can imagine.
Finally.
Yeah.
And they said, well, okay, but you've got to make it in 6 months. And I said, well, we can't do anything meaningful in 6 months.
Yeah.
Yeah, we probably could employ people to help us. We had, they would probably fund the development again, but we just said flat out, it's not possible really to do something meaningful in 6 months. So they said, well, okay, why don't we do the next sequel in-house here at Microprose, and you can then work on a third game, which became XCOM Apocalypse, and the direct sequel became XCOM Terror from the Deep.
Hmm.
And this game, which they said we had to do in 6 months, was actually made in-house at Microprose by a team of around 12 people, and it took them a year, not 6 months.
Yeah, right. So vindication.
But
on your
so
side
they licensed our code base. So we're still getting royalties from this, which is good.
Right. Yeah. Fantastic.
So we did XCOM Apocalypse, which again was a very complex, ambitious game, which I probably regret doing. But there you go.
Well, let's actually talk about some regrets or some things like looking back on XCOM and the series and stuff, because it's obviously gone on to not just be a seminal classic, but then also obviously spark Firaxis's series of XCOM games, which are also much beloved. Jake Solomon and his crew obviously did incredible work there. Now, but if you could, thinking about the game, was there anything that you, even after all of these years, you're like, oh, I would have done that differently, or I wish I could have changed that, or we put too much into this, or does it kind of, in your eyes, does it seem like a perfect project? How do you feel about it looking back on it, even though it is so beloved?
It was kind of a perfect project in a way, because we basically did this without hardly any interference, shall we say.
Yeah.
At the beginning, there was some good feedback from Microprose on the art and some of the alien designs, and we just incorporated that, and then we just made the game, and it was like beginning to end. We just got on with it, which is great.
Fantastic.
So that's something that's never happened since. So there you go.
Right, okay.
So in a way, it kind of was that ideal situation where we were such a small team working under the radar, again, because in the later stage it was officially cancelled anyway, and we were just left to get on with it. At the very final moment, they said, that when the crunch period happened, it was all focused on getting the game finished, and they were all about supporting that, which is great. So,
right.
So again, we had
aligned to just make it as smooth as possible. Yeah.
Yeah, we had such minimal interference on everything we're doing, the way the game looked, the way it designed, the way it played. It was 100% down to us. Never experienced that again since.
Yeah, it's incredible what can happen when you just trust the creatives to do their work and give them the resources and support that they need, right?
Yeah. Although it was only just about enough resources to live on in this case. But
right, so that's a missing ingredient too. You got to keep them hungry. Yeah.
In a way, it was kind of worked in that sense. But, it was it was great. Would I have done things different? I probably would have asked for more money, so we could have got some more support in terms of the game project could have been done quicker for sure.
Yeah.
But, it's just me and Nick coding it. I mean, it took what we thought was an extraordinary long time to make it, around about 2.5 years.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Which we thought was huge.
That was a long time for development back in the,
back then, yes.
Now, another interesting thing about XCOM and the legacy that it's gone on to have from a design perspective too, in the turn-based sort of genre and stuff like that, is it very much seems like you and then Nick, obviously, once you started making games together, but there's you pointed out yourself, a pattern or a sort of a line from your childhood playing games together. Obviously, Nick's there playing board games, right, too. Then heading towards this. What do you think were some of the design principles that contributed to XCOM in your mind being so impressive and just impacting people so intensely when it came out? Because it does seem like you were moving towards this. This doesn't feel like a fluke once you look at your, ludology, like the games that you've created and that you and Nick were making. This seemed like the next iteration with a bit of a push for Microprose.
Yeah, what really contributed it? So for sure, there's definitely a bit of an RPG influence in there, again, which wasn't common in turn-based tactical games. So in particular with your soldiers and your recruits that you had in the game, these little rookies, which were like cannon fodder, but they developed and they got better. And then they become very precious to you. And if you lost them, so this became a very important feature of the game from many people. So it had that sort of role playing element, and people would name these characters after their friends or their whatever favorite characters, and it is like very much like a squad nurturing simulation as much as anything.
Yeah.
Other influences were trying to get the sense of the unknown, the fact the enemies were hidden or in darkness. Influences, especially my favorite film, at the time was Alien and the sequel Aliens, for example. Yep. There was also that influence from some of the board games I played. I love this idea of the meta game and the tactical game, which I tried to incorporate elements of this from what I played in games like Freedom in the Galaxy, where you'd have the character level, the galaxy level, different levels in the game.
Yeah.
Something I really wanted to get across. You were actually a commander of a world, of an organization which is responsible for looking after the entire world.
Yeah. So you needed to represent that scale, right?
Yeah. So that was, that was the origin of our attempt to, let's put the world in the game. The world is the main feature of the game. Those are all the influences that I think contributed to making it something kind of really interesting and unique.
Yeah. It's definitely mirrored, I think, by what people say about the game as well. But we've got other games and other parts of your career to talk about. So you went on Mythos. I think you wrapped up Mythos in around 2001, if I'm correct, and then founded Kodo.
Yep. And we did, we did a couple of games there. So we did Laser Squads, again, back to me and networking. We made Laser Squad Nemesis, which is a online 2-player tactical game, which is very cool. We ran that for a while. We made a turn-based tactical game for Namco Bandai called Rebel Star Tactical Command on the Game Boy Advance. I was very fond of Nintendo handheld consoles and still remain to this day.
Yeah.
Just got my Switch 2 actually yesterday.
Oh, so, fantastic! Congratulations, launch day. I worked at a studio called Taurus Games, and Taurus came to fruition, or not fruition, I should say, sort of prominence by just being able to churn out Game Boy Advance games. They created this proprietary tech. They had this mad Scotsman who was this incredible programmer called Bill McIntosh, was a CEO, and him and the tools team, they just were incredibly insightful about their engines and their tool set. And by the time these handheld Nintendo consoles rolled around, it was just their heyday. And they made dozens of them for the Advance. It was really their era. It's just such a delightful platform to develop for.
Yeah, I really liked it. I mean, I was very heavily inspired by, very pleased by games like Advance Wars, particular, and Fire Emblem. These turn-based games could have life on such a console, because you have to remember in the PC game space, late 90s, early 2000s, everything was dominated by real-time strategy games. Everybody's saying turn-based games are dead. And then, I found this lovely little game on the Game Boy Advance called Advance Wars, which was fantastic, a very accessible and fun game to play, but still, at its heart, a pretty hardcore turn-based war game, and very cool.
And you actually spent quite a chunk of your career there developing handheld strategy games as well, right?
Yeah, well, especially when I started working at Ubisoft. Ubisoft in Sofia here in Bulgaria, we were working on particularly titles for the Nintendo DS. Actually, the first title they asked me to work on, because I applied to work for them as a game designer. And the first project they gave me was chess, which I thought was very bizarre, because I thought that the game of chess had actually already been designed. Didn't require much a game design. But what we did was we created a really cool series of mini games based on chess rules, which were cool games in their own right, but taught chess, chess rules and maneuvers and stuff. So we did. Interesting, at Ubisoft again, I worked on a bunch of titles which were not very interesting. and
But
when it
that
got cancelled.
just to stop for a moment on that chess, that chess title was Chess Master as well, right?
Yes,
It was a version of Chess
yes.
Master, which is
It
the much
was
beloved.
specifically Josh Waitskin's Chess Master.
Yeah.
Yes, it was.
Tell me about working with a game like, we've gone from you developing XCOM with, the rails
Yeah.
completely off, and now you're given chess, as you say, a complete zero-sum game, essentially, right? Like finished. How do you approach that as a designer? You said mini games and
Well, yeah, it's kind of difficult because the remit that we were given is it must be like a brain training game that improves your brain, and we have to measure how it improves your brain
as well, wasn't it?
because
Right?
brain training was all the craze, and so Ubisoft were very much wanted to do their kind of own versions of brain training, and somebody there had the bright idea. Well, if we match chess with brain training, it's bound to be amazingly successful. So we had to invent some kind of brain score system for completing all these little mini games and stuff.
Right.
Which is a bit silly looking back on it, but nonetheless, it was kind of fun little project, I guess.
Yeah, none of us escape the crazes when they find their way through, right? I remember I worked for this incredibly talented gentleman at one point who had done everything in the industry. He'd been an executive and a QA guy and like a designer and a producer and just one of these people that just have so much experience in a range of different places. And he was telling me about, I can't remember if it was EA or Ubisoft or something where he was working, but they had made a pets game and they had made a fashion game. And they were saying like one of the execs was coming down to the dev floor and they were like, oh, if we have to make another pets or another fashion game, I'm going to quit. And he came to the floor and he's like, we've got the next big thing, folks. It's pets fashion. So the next game. And it was like, he was like, I just quit that day. That was it. I had enough. But it was the perfect of just matching the two crates. So it comes for us all, Julian, you all have to pay our penance every now and then to get to design these video games.
Yeah. I mean, it was interesting working for Ubisoft because I've never had a job in my life. I've always been self-employed. I never worked for anyone else up to this point. I mean, ever. Up until this point that I applied for this job at Ubisoft. I do remember I did apply for a job with Virgin Games at once, though I applied as an artist, I think, bizarrely, rather than a game designer, because I didn't think game designers actually existed as a job.
The jury was out at that point, yeah.
So I didn't get that job. But anyway, so it was very interesting working for Ubisoft, especially an organization as large as Ubisoft. About how much resources they put into projects which ultimately go nowhere. And they're often explorations somebody has some marketing angle for, but has no idea how to implement, or somebody wants to implement something which has no marketing basis. It's kind of it seemed like for an organization so large, it seemed quite hit and miss in many respects. But of course, you normally don't get to see that. You don't get to know about even all the projects that were cancelled. Nobody talks about them. Yeah. And I certainly worked on my fair share of those.
Only a few people are told where the bodies are buried, right?
Yeah. But I mean, it get to a point where I remember I pitched to the editorial team at Ubisoft a game which was I was basically taking an IP, and we took one of the Tom Clancy's IPs, Ghost Recon. Ghost Recon meets XCOM, but for the Nintendo DS was the basic elevator pitch.
Great concept, yeah. I'll
which they really liked, and they said, go for it. And we started working on this game. It was again quite a troubled development because at one point we had to switch from Nintendo DS development to 3DS, which was, of course, Nintendo's new console, which is tip-top secret at the time. And I said, you must be a launch title for the 3DS. So we had this really hard deadline. And even our initial sort of prototype that we showed to the Ubisoft editorial team at what they call their first publishable playable meeting, which is basically the sort of kickoff green light meeting for the project. They said that what we produced then was rubbish. You had to go away and remake it.
All right.
Well, they did have a point. I mean, what they were saying was, well, you need to make it more like Advance Wars because that's what people expect on the DS. And I said, well, all right, fair comment. So we sort of reverse engineered the Advance Wars kind of UI system, their control system. We then obviously tweaked it and modified it, and this became Ghost Recon Shadow Wars, which we did manage to get done for the launch of the Nintendo 3DS, and was actually a pretty good turn-based game, believe it or not.
I'm looking at it now. It looks fantastic. I love the art style. The art direction's incredible. Really cool.
Yeah. The art director on that, Bobby, works with me here at Snapshot Games to this day as
Oh,
art
great.
director
Fantastic.
here. Yeah.
Very cool. Well, what a perfect segue. So now let's talk about Snapshot Games, because I think it was around 2013 that Snapshot came about. Tell me about how that happened, and then your first kind of foray into the world, if I'm correct, was via Chaos and Kickstarter, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So this was the beginning of the Kickstarter revolution, and I'd heard about and read about Double Fine Adventure, which was the big notable Kickstarter success for Tim Schafer and Double Fine Games. And I thought, well, maybe I could do this. If I was going to sort of bootstrap a company, this seems like the ideal way to do it.
Yeah, slingshot, off the back of this Kickstarter stuff.
Yeah, so I took the plunge and left Ubisoft and started to figure out how to, what project I should work on. It was a bit of a risk, obviously. I had 2 young children, 1-year-old at the time. I was leaving a secure job to become an entrepreneur again with an uncertain future. But what can you do? I'm just an addict. So I settled on doing a remake of the original Chaos, because I thought, well, that would at least reach an audience because people still remember the game. And that became our first Kickstarter project, Chaos Reborn, which was the turn-based wizard fighting combat game. And together with my business partner, who was David Kay from the US, he helped me set stuff up. We set up Snapshot Games. And here in Sofia in Bulgaria, I had Bobby from Ubisoft. Got a programmer guy in, Sergey, who was still our CTO to this day. Started with a very small team, and had a successful Kickstarter campaign. And it was still a little bit touch and go. It's still not easy to get noticed and get an audience, but we managed to just about get our crowdfunding goal. And it was kind of a good time for doing, the indie scene was getting big.
Yeah.
Actually, I remember your game, Armello, was also doing it.
Yeah, similar time.
Around about similar time, because I remember it very distinctly. Also, very successful Kickstarter.
Yeah, we had the same idea as you.
Yeah, so
we'd actually been tinkering for a little bit on it, and we were trying to find a way to do Kickstarter, but it hadn't launched in Australia, and you had to launch like an American LLC.
Yes, exactly.
It was around the time that you did it, it had opened up in Australia as well, and so we're like, so that's what prompted us to do it.
Yeah. I mean, it's a great time, and of course, Steam was also opening up because they were also very closed. They had a new system where you could get votes from the public to get your game onto Steam.
Yeah, Steam Greenlight. Yeah,
exactly. Yes. So that came out at roughly the same time. These two things alone, I think, really gave a huge boost to the indie scene.
Yeah, massively.
Fortunate to be the right place at the right time for that one.
So you got your money. You're off and running with a team. Give us a little snapshot of Chaos Reborn's development. Because it did actually set up the foundations for this studio, as you're saying, that's gone on to develop Phoenix Point, and now obviously Chips and Clawz is coming out.
Yeah, it did. So again, probably a bit too ambitious. We had a whole online mode. We had a little sort of adventure creation system. We had user-generated content. It was quite big and adventurous. It was still a little bit probably too multiplayer focused, because as a single player experience, it wasn't that brilliant.
Right.
But as a multiplayer game, it's still great. By the way, it's still really good. There were some controversial aspects in terms of the way the randomness is used in the game, because a lot of video game players do not like randomness.
Yeah, we run amok of that one as well.
Yeah. I mean, board game players, D&D players, role playing game players are absolutely used to it and are fine with it. But any element of randomness, you get this certain portion of the player base are extremely negative towards it.
Yeah.
And it's kind of an interesting piece of psychology how that works.
It really is. Even the difference, I know Soren Johnson has spoken a lot about input randomness versus output randomness as well. It's like when it's affecting you and when it's benefiting you. And yeah, we learned, I think we weighed it into, because we were just like, we love tabletop games and we're going to bring them to life. And we were that crowd that you mentioned that were fine with it. And so we were very surprised when we encountered that community that were not just not okay with it, but were like a mortal crime had been committed against them in the name of video games,
Yeah. And also, obviously, our Mallow is like, it is a board game which is implemented in a computer, very beautiful looking game.
Yeah,
but still, you can see, it is essentially a board game design at heart.
Yeah. We prototyped the whole thing on paper for 8 months. That's how it started out.
There you go. Yeah,
but it is interesting that.
So yeah, that was an issue. We actually made a version of the game which had reduced randomness in it, but we probably should have done something to compromise that initially as well. It's kind of like it's very something that you learn after the event, I guess, in some ways.
Yeah.
But there you go. So yeah, that was, I say, moderately successful for us. And getting into our next game. I know David in particular was keen that we do something more ambitious, and he wanted to do let's revive XCOM in some way. This is how we came up with Phoenix Point. And again, we did another crowdfunding campaign for this, although on a different platform called Fig. The interesting thing about this platform is that people could also invest in the game by buying a share in the profits of the game. Which is a very interesting idea. It kind of worked out quite well for us because we sold all of our shares, so to speak, in the game. So it raised some extra cash. But it was a very wildly ambitious project. And we had to build the studio on the basis of this as well. Ultimately, the usual problem, ran out of money. So we managed to get some good deals. Again, being in the right place at the right time, we actually got a deal for Game Pass with Microsoft and a deal with Epic Games to have a 1-year exclusive on their brand new platform.
Right.
Which helped us get to the finishing line. Although that was quite controversial at the time because the initial launch of the Epic Game Store was somewhat surrounded in controversy and accusations of Chinese spyware and all the rest of it.
Yeah, wild times. Yeah, I remember a dev team who will remain unnamed calling me an indie team, small indie team, and they had been offered Epic exclusivity for millions of dollars. And they called me and they asked whether they should do it because, I'd spoken to them and, I'm offering indies advice on random stuff every now and then. I don't know why, but some of them come to me. And they were concerned particularly about this controversy.
Yeah.
And I was just like, the controversy will go away, but it will take much longer for that money to leave your bank account. So say yes to the deal. And they were like, okay, thank you. We needed to hear that. Yeah.
Yeah, sound advice. And, I mean, in reality, Steam had become so dominant. It is at least good that there is some challenge to this.
Yeah.
And in Epic Game Store, even if you didn't take an exclusive deal, was at least offering a better deal to small developers. So, competition is needed. It's not. People obviously were. The old conspiracy theories were rife.
Yeah, it's good.
And
we
there's
need
not
more
much you can do
to.
You can't really argue against it. You just, as you say, it will die away over time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So you've gotten it to the finish line. I imagine a battle hard one.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then you release the game. How does it perform? How you
yeah? So we released it. It was a bit of a buggy mess, to be honest. It really needed a lot of fixes. We did fix a bunch of stuff for the Steam release, which came a year later. but the problem was that we'd already committed to working on a lot of DLC, and the DLC took priority rather than fixing the game, which is probably something that I regret, because in reality we needed to fix the fundamentals before working all these DLCs, which ultimately there were at least 5 of them that we made.
Wow.
But still, even though the reception was somewhat mixed from players, people loved the tactical combat system, but the actual progression through the game was not great, especially in the later stages. But despite all that, it was very profitable for us, very successful. And to the extent that, we gained the attention of Embracer at that point. We sold the company to Embracer.
Congratulations.
Which we saw as a way to somewhat securing the future of the studio, because when you're responsible for, nearly 60 people, it's a lot different than, just, me and Nick working together, for example.
Yeah, there's a very...
I can endure poverty every now and again, but
yeah,
it's not something you can willingly inflict on other people, unfortunately.
I know. There's a very unique experience that comes with being a founder that scales a company, which is the shock and amazement that you have at how much the monthly or even fortnightly burn rate goes up seemingly exponentially. You're like, that's, I would get the pay run from our finance manager, and you're like, I'm seeing everything that's going out of the company, but that's, and she's like, yeah, that's what it's adding up to. I'm like, wow, okay, that's our burn rate. All right.
Yep. And as you know, the difficulty of game development is the fact that projects have very different requirements at different stages. You normally don't want a big team for a lot of the time developing. Actually, they only want everybody to come in. You don't have. It's very difficult to ramp up and ramp down projects while still maintaining roughly the same size like studio. I mean, it's incredibly difficult to manage. So there's that point where you're going beyond just indie, where it becomes actually quite a bit more difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially as, you were saying, David, and your team's priority with this one was to be more ambitious, right? Is to push that scope, push that quality level. Yeah. Reach that next stage. It's everything comes along with that, right?
Yep. Indeed.
So you've sold to Embracer. You've now got the ability to continue on. You've secured the stability of the studio.
Yep.
Is this when development of Chips and Clawz begins?
Well, that began actually quite a few years ago, because initially it was, again, just a prototype.
Yeah, okay.
So, my friend Dean Calver is working on this. He actually worked with me back at Mythos Games in 2000. But yes, he actually joined us. We were working on a prototype for this in 2020, which we left for a while. Originally, the prototype was initially to explore what we could do with the Unreal Engine, because up to that point, we've been working in Unity exclusively. We came back to it. Embracer said, the game's interesting, but you need to find an IP. You've got to use an IP for this. And we explored multiple IPs. We did several different versions of the game, different skins, different characters and everything. Then ultimately came back to, Saber Interactive then, who was our immediate
parent company
boss in the overall structure.
Right. Yeah.
So, okay, let's just get it to release and do your own IP. So the 4th version of the game is actually what Chip and Clawz currently is. This is very interesting design, because it's what we call an action strategy game, and it has conventional action elements in the sense you have a third-person character control, but it has some very interesting real-time strategy elements to it as well. You have resource collection, building, controlling your different minions that you summon through these buildings, and so on.
Yeah, looking at the gameplay videos and the trailers, there's the only thing that I could think is sort of close to it is Brutal Legend had these kind of moments where you would run around, and kind of RTS elements to it as well. It was kind of bringing that kind of nostalgia back a little.
Yeah, Brutal. I hadn't played Brutal Legend, I must admit, before we made the original version of Chip and Clawz. Now, I did play it later, because it has, again, this kind of character-based strategy game, if you want to call it that, immersive strategy game. Oh, yes, yeah, our implementation is somewhat different to Brutal Legend. In a way, with Chip and Clawz, we actually stripped down quite a lot. We removed a lot of stuff we thought was getting in the way of efficiently directing your troops, because the battles are very quick. If you're doing a PvP battle, it's like 5 to 10 minutes, and players need to be able to direct their forces very quickly. So we have a very simple system. It's constrained. It obviously has limitations. You have 4 rally beacons. You can place them. They direct the 4 types of forces that you've got.
Mm-hmm.
You have a little command view, which the camera zips up and you can see the battlefield very clearly. So this all worked very nicely. We got rid of the minimap. We got rid of any complex commands. Everything had to work very efficiently and quick through a controller setup.
Yeah.
And it kind of works. It's really interesting. Gameplay is really frantic. Multiplayer is huge fun. And the team did a great job also with the single player experience. We have a whole bunch of very different styles of missions. We have like tower defense style missions. We have like escort missions. We have like very puzzle based missions, because one influence, initially was the again, another Nintendo game, Pikmin, one of my favorites, was a bit of an influence here as well with Chip and Clawz. So it's turned out to be a really cool project. Very fun to work on.
Yeah, the challenges must have been incredibly enjoyable to work through in regards to these real-time strategy elements that usually we have this bird's eye kind of god level overview of a map, right? And you're able to whip a mouse quickly around. Some games like StarCraft, that is the entire game. You're right. You're just this Twitch gameplay from 10,000 feet in the sky. Tell me specifically about the view of the play space and how you adapted that to being third person, and any interesting sort of design outcomes from there.
Yeah, so it was an interesting challenge. The temptation was to fall back on conventions. So when we were developing the game initially, we didn't have, for example, a mini map or an overhead map.
Mm-hmm.
People said, "Oh, I need an overhead map," and we thought, well, "Why do you need an overhead map?" Like, we put one in,
mm-hmm.
and I thought, "Oh, it's just a bit crap. Let's take that again." Somebody suggested, well, why don't you just zip the camera up so you can see from your point of view, so it doesn't upset your sense of where you are, but you can see most of the battlefield.
Yeah,
I thought, okay, this works fine. And obviously, in terms of the way the level design works, levels are not huge, and you can generally see most of the battlefield, if not all of it, at least in multiplayer matches, fairly easily. And yeah, it kind of really worked. It's a nice sort of schematic view of the battlefield, but it's still relatable from your position as a character within the environment. So yeah, very cool system. But yeah, we added to it, and then we took stuff away to get to where we are, and that's usually a very good process in design.
The courage to take things away, right? Like, because once you've committed it to the game, people's work, there's a sunk cost fallacy that so many of us feel once we're faced with those tough decisions.
Yeah. I mean, we've changed things. Most of our changes were to make the game easier for players to understand, more accessible, and to avoid, if there's a problem with the way something works, can we just, cut it out of the game entirely, for example? So, and we used to have a situation where resources were needed to spawn all of your minions from the buildings, but actually we changed that to, once you placed a building, it would spawn minions endlessly. It would just replace the ones that were lost, but it would support a group of 3 of them, so that you didn't have to worry about more of the complex economic stuff going on under the game. Right. So yeah, a lot of the changes we made were ultimately to try to simplify the game, to get to the essence of what actually makes it kind of fun, I guess.
You said something interesting before, which is people would lean on conventions to solve problems as an immediate kind of like off the shelf things. Now, I find that interesting, especially in through your lens, I can imagine you started developing games. Well, as you said, there's no game engines. You're doing everything. You're rendering the sprites on screen, right? Like there's not a single library basically for you to start with even. But now we have developers or, kids when they're first learning game engines, they have a shooter out of the box with all the bells and whistles and physics and everything. And it puts them so far down the development path that it almost creates this style of thinking about game development and a frame of mind where, there is this ease of accessibility and we're putting things together. And then you have decades of design conventions and everything that have been refined and iterated over time. It is so hard not to reach for them at every point. How do you find yourself, and whether it's when you're working with younger game designers or even you yourself wanting to lean on them, how do you know when the moment is right to grab something that is, like a tried and true convention that might be a solve for this versus finding your own bespoke path through a solution or through a problem to a solution?
Good question. It is always a balance because to some extent you don't want to do something so completely new that players just can't understand what it is. Can't understand what you're trying to do. There is a good case to be said that you've got to find something relatable that players kind of know, and the innovative bits are the things where you want to lead them. You take them from where they are and where you want to go. Using existing design conventions and tropes is absolutely valid because that gives you the hook where players can relate to that and they understand it. But the true appeal of what you're doing is the innovative stuff, which is actually more difficult to explain to a player. I mean, as you know, with so many highly defined genres within video games. I mean, there's a lot of them, and there's a huge, diverse player community. But still, there is usually the attempt to players want to know exactly, what genre is this game? What is it? Is it a MOBA? Is it a shooter? Is it an extraction shooter? Whatever the latest genre is, they want it has to fit within the established one. That's kind of difficult. So it's very difficult if you want to do something innovative, to break out of some of these constraints or straitjackets that the industry is sort of created, spontaneously in some ways. It's difficult to navigate. I usually want to do at least something innovative when I'm making a new game, but I do understand the reason. You need to build on what's gone before. You need something which has a foundation which players can relate to start with, I think.
Is there anything that you're playing at the moment or have played recently that has, felt truly innovative to you, or in maybe even in a small way, or in the way that it's presented in a big way?
Oof. That's an interesting question. The
answer it's okay to say no as well if you're not impressed by anything that's come by recently.
Not a lot. I mean, the only one that stands out recently is Balatro, but there you go.
Yeah, there you go. All right. Good stuff.
I do like the way that, again, he's taken a convention which is kind of a bit relatable, which is this card-based poker-style hierarchy, but made something completely innovative out of it. And it's a good example, kind of, I guess, of what I was saying in a way.
Yeah.
There is a relatable thing, but there's something which is really different and interesting going on there as well.
Yeah. And he's definitely managed to crack through to an interested audience, we could say.
Absolutely, yes. You could say that. You could say that indeed.
Well, Julian, I absolutely wish the same for you with Chip and Clawz versus the Brainioids. For anyone who's listening now, the demo is actually available on Steam as literally at the time of recording. I'm looking at it. You can download it. So go ahead and try out the demo. And Julian, thank you so much for chatting with me tonight and filling us all in on your story. It's such an honor to be able to chat to you, considering the legacy that you've contributed to games, and just hearing these incredible stories about how games that we've played, through our past and stuff have come together through your lens.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.